Hi, I'm Peter Rowlett.
And I'm Katie Steckles. And Peter, what's today's mathematical object?
Today's mathematical object is an auctioneer's hammer, and we brought a special guest along to talk about that. Hello, Tim Harford.
Hello, thank you for having me on the show.
Well, thank you for coming.
That's my pleasure. My pleasure. We should talk about hammers.
Yes.
So the reason that I found the auctioneer's hammer compelling is not because of any properties of the hammer itself. Actually, as Katie and I were figuring out just before we began this conversation, we don't actually know, well, I don't actually know what an auctioneer's hammer even looks like. I'm interested in the auction itself. And when you think about an auction, you think about some gentleman in a three-piece suit at the front of an auction hall, talking really, really fast, everyone getting very, very excited. It's probably a Fabergé egg or something. It's the kind of setting where James Bond would be right at home. And it seems to have nothing to do with maths, and actually not that much to do with economics. It's all about the emotions. But actually auctions are highly mathematical and I think fascinating.
Yeah, I think because as you say, it's a thing you see in films, or I'm not in the business of buying fine art, so I don't have much personal experience of it. But the first time I became aware of auctions as a mathematical thing, there was a president of the Institute of Mathematics and its Applications called Mike Walker, who'd worked for Vodafone during the 3G Spectrum auction in 2000 or so.
Yeah.
And he gave a talk, his sort of presidential address was about this, and that was a whole complicated thing, because there were sort of 5 bits of spectrum that you could bid for, and you could only bid for one at a time, and there were all sorts of other rules, like there had to be a new entrant into the market. There were sealed bids, but every round you got to find out what the sealed bids were and then rebid again, and you could either change to a different one, but if you were winning a bid, you had to stick with it. And it was just this very complicated thing that made it sound it was so much more than, keep putting your hand up when you get to the right number. So.
Yeah, it's absolutely fascinating. And those particular auctions I know quite well because my thesis supervisor, I wrote my thesis on auctions, and my thesis supervisor, Paul Klemperer, who's a professor at Oxford University, was one of the lead designers of those auctions. So your friend at the IMA was on the other side of that.
Yeah.
He was bidding and trying to win spectrum rights, basically the right to operate a mobile phone service for the lowest possible price. And Paul's job and the job of the other people working on the design team was really twofold: to get the highest possible price for the taxpayer. It's a public asset that's being sold, so you want it the highest possible price, but you also want it to go to the right people. And by the right people, we mean, presumably, the people who are going to use it in the most productive way. And when you start to realize, well, hang on, there's a finite amount of spectrum, we can split it up in different ways, we can have 4 chunks of spectrum, we can have 5 chunks of spectrum, you start to realize it's a complex design problem. So, let me give you an example of a way that you might not want to design an auction. So you could say, oh, well, just auction spectrum A, then spectrum B, then spectrum C, then D, then E. We'll just do the first one first. And have a think about that, how that works. The first thing that happens there is that people don't really know what to bid on chunk A, because they don't know how many people there will be frantically bidding on chunk E. They'd really like to know what the price of chunk E is before they bid on chunk A. And that's particularly true if, say what you really want is license B. You want that chunk of the spectrum. That's the one you really want, but if you can't get it, then license A is the one you would have as a backup.
Yeah, because these weren't just identical bins.
No, they weren't.
I remember specifically that because they're different wavelengths, some of them required you to have mobile phone towers more often.
Yeah.
Because the wavelength meant that it was the power that you had, you could only transmit over this distance or something.
Yeah, absolutely. So you're in this situation where you don't want license A at all if you can get license B, but you don't know whether you're going to win license B until it's all finished on license A. So for that reason, they designed this apparently quite complicated, I think it was simple enough actually, but superficially complicated auction where all of this stuff was going on all of the time, and where at any point you could just sort of hop off one license and start bidding on another. And as long as one of the licenses still had active bidders, they were all potentially still in play. You could always sort of give up and go, oh, well, I'll go and bid on a different license. But not straightforward at all. And another thing that could easily go wrong is, let's say you've got 5 strong bidders and 5 licenses, and then you've got a whole bunch of weak bidders. Well, in that particular case, there's effectively no competition at all, because the weak bidders are like, well, we know who's going to end up winning this. It's going to be Orange and Vodafone and BT, and we'll never win. So why would we assemble a team of lawyers? Why would we get this big bank loan for hundreds of millions of pounds just in case we need it? Why would we bother to do any of that when we know we're going to lose? So those people don't even bother to bid. And if they don't bother to bid, then effectively all of the licenses, you've got 5 licenses, 5 incumbents, the license goes for basically 0. So, you really need to think about that, because that can make the difference between effectively giving the things away for free and selling them for, it was about £20 billion, if I remember right. So this is quite high stakes to get this right.
Yeah, it's interesting to me because much like Peter, I've never been to an auction. My main experience is buying things on eBay, and in that situation, it's that sort of very simple, intuitive thing of you say how much you're prepared to pay for a thing, and then it automatically bids up for you until you get to the amount that you're prepared to say, and then if someone else is prepared to pay more, they'll get the thing, and that definitely works for a very simple situation where you've just got a thing that you're selling, and you maybe have a minimum price that you want to sell it for, but you want to see who is prepared to pay the most for it. And I guess that's what people think of as standard when they think about auctions. But then you get all of these sort of different approaches to it, things like sealed bids, and it becomes more kind of game theory, doesn't it? I guess if you've got a more complicated setup.
And actually, these Spectrum auctions, which took place, well, they still take place, but the most famous ones were about 20 years ago. They cleared for billions of pounds, billions of dollars, billions of euros in these different countries. But actually, there's way more than that at stake, because Google is running auctions all the time for the right to display ads by the side of your Google search. So you've got your Google search, and then along the side, you've got all of these adverts. And this is where almost all of Google's money comes from. I speak loosely, but this is one of the most valuable companies in the world. And what it's selling is advertising space, and it's selling it at auction. And again, the auction is not straightforward. So let's say I search for Hopper Nighthawks, this famous painting by Edward Hopper, on Google. Well, probably I just want to see a picture of Nighthawks, so I want to understand the history of Nighthawks. But I might be in the market for, well, what am I in the market for at that point? So maybe somebody wants to sell me a book about Edward Hopper, or maybe somebody wants to sell me an Edward Hopper print. Or maybe Sotheby's would like me to come to an auction of Edward Hopper's work. And presumably the person selling the Hopper prints might get tens of thousands of clicks, but doesn't want to pay very much per click. Whereas Sotheby's might happily spend thousands of pounds to have an extra bidder in their Hopper auction. That's hugely important for them. So they might be willing to pay a huge amount of money for just one click. So Google wants the maximum total revenue. So it might be tens of thousands of clicks at a penny a click, or it might be a few clicks at hundreds of pounds a click. When you start to think of it that way, you start to realize this is not a straightforward problem at all.
So what's going on there mathematically in the game theory? How would you interpret that?
So actually Google have a very nice interpretation of how this thing works, because of course lots and lots of people pay for adverts on Google, so they want a nice YouTube video. Of course, Google own YouTube. Nice YouTube video explaining how it all works. And what they're trying to do is you're bidding for effectively the product of your clicks versus the value per click. But Google is trying to predict how many clicks you're going to have. And so Google has its own further modification based on the assessed quality of the website that you're clicking through to. So if it looks like a really shoddy website, Google applies a discount. And if it looks like a high quality website, that's the kind of thing that Google wants to favor. So when I say applies a discount, if your website's good, you get a better deal from Google. You don't have to pay as much. So all of this stuff is constantly being optimized, and millions, hundreds of millions of these auctions are being run in parallel with a Google search, really every minute around the world. But you mentioned game theory. So game theory is the mathematics behind all of this. There is a maths of auctions. It's not just a psychology, and it's not just engineering. There is a mathematical idea behind it. And maybe we should talk a bit about game theory. So this is an idea that goes back to just before the the Second World War and the great Hungarian mathematician John von Neumann. Von Neumann, I think, will be well known to maths lovers everywhere. He's a famously brilliant mathematician who made advances in all kinds of fields of mathematics, worked on the development of the atomic bomb, worked on the development of the computer. But his work on game theory was an attempt to try to put into mathematical terms the analysis of what economists often call strategic interaction. So I'm trying to make a decision. I've got various payoffs to various decision points, various possible outcomes. What makes it game theory is it's not just a decision tree with kind of random outcomes at each point of the decision tree. There are other people, or at least one other person, also making decisions. And when I decide what I'm going to do, I have to think about what my opponent is going to do. So the most famous work in game theory is the 1944 book, Theory of Games and Economic Behavior, that was written with the economist Oscar Morgenstern. There's a fascinating collaboration, by the way. Morgenstern, I think, was a basically borderline fascist, anti-Semite who reformed and teamed up with one of the world's most famous Jewish thinkers, John von Neumann. I mean, it's an amazing and slightly weird collaboration. But that was published in 1944, and that set out the whole idea of zero-sum games. And it was developed subsequently by people such as John Nash, famous from A Beautiful Mind.
Well, this is so Peter teaches a module on game theory and recreational maths at the university, and I was also part of that when I was there.
But my game theory is much more two people are playing noughts and crosses or NIM or something, and we do a little bit of payoff matrix in Prisoner's Dilemma, because I sort of feel like a student who graduates with game theory on their transcript probably ought to know what Prisoner's Dilemma is.
Yes.
but I'm not coming at it from the economics point of view, if you see what I mean.
Well, no, fair enough. I actually think the Prisoner's Dilemma is overrated. So, but it's interesting that it is such a famous game. So we should probably say a little bit about... So Noughts and Crosses is a zero-sum game. This is the classic game that was originally... the classic kind of game that was originally analysed by von Neumann, although he was really interested in poker because poker has randomness and hidden information and the capacity to bluff. So it's a more interesting game than tic-tac-toe or Noughts and Crosses. They're both zero-sum in the sense that, whatever I win, you lose. Mm-hmm. Now, the Prisoner's Dilemma is this very famous kind of setup. We should say a few words about it. So imagine you're arrested by the KGB, say, and they put you in prison and they say you're suspected of treason against the Soviet Union, and you've obviously got this secret code in your violin case, and you say, look, the secret code is just the sheet music to Tchaikovsky's Third Violin Concerto. It's not a secret code at all, it's just music. And then the KGB say, well, we've caught your co-conspirator Tchaikovsky and he's willing to talk. Will you? So you're in this sort of bizarre situation where there are two people accused of a crime and you're under pressure to confess. And the idea is if you confess and if Tchaikovsky also confesses, then you're both going to do 5 years. If Tchaikovsky confesses and you don't, he'll get off scot-free and you'll go down for 20 years and vice versa. If both of you stay silent, you'll just get a 3-month sentence for obstructing justice or something like that. So when you think about the payoffs there, if Tchaikovsky confesses, you're better off confessing. And if Tchaikovsky doesn't confess, you're still better off confessing. Either way, you do better by confessing. And either way, Tchaikovsky does better by confessing. What makes it a dilemma is that if you both confess, you're worse off than if you both stayed silent. Now, this is not a zero-sum game. That's one of the things that makes it fascinating. Like, you and Tchaikovsky can both do better if you can somehow find a way to not confess, to both not confess. But, you've got no way of communicating. And even if you had a way of communicating, you've got no way of agreeing to a binding commitment. Actually, the communication is kind of irrelevant. It's like you can't credibly promise. And that's what makes it a dilemma, and that's what makes it intriguing.
Yeah, I mean, you say not enough conversation, there's not communication between people in the Prisoner's Dilemma, but the existence of the game show Golden Balls has essentially just produced hours of footage of people in the Prisoner's Dilemma having a conversation about it and trying to convince each other, and you still can't trust anything they're saying because they could just be saying anything.
Yeah, that's what I do in my game theory class, is largely placing clips from Golden Balls, and we talk about
It's a gift. It's a gift to people teaching game theory.
But what bothers me about it is that I sort of feel like I ought to tell students about it. But what I'm saying is, there is this area of economics that deals with payoff matrices. Here's what a payoff matrix is, and here's a way in which they don't really work very well.
Yeah.
Because it creates this paradox. So you're sort of immediately not showing them the value of the tool.
Yeah, I think auctions are more interesting. So auctions are also a game theoretic situation, because you're trying to figure out how to bid, and what you're willing to bid is depends on the structure of the auction, but depends on how many other people there are in the auction and what you think they're willing to bid. In some auctions, you can just sort of wait and see what other people do. In other auctions, you just have to write down your best bid, put it in an envelope, and submit the envelope. And clearly, in that sort of auction, a sealed bid auction, as Katie mentioned, you've got to do a lot of guesswork about what the other people in the auction think about the prize and what they're willing to pay. Because in a classic first price sealed bid auction, if you win, you just pay what's in the envelope. And you might end up bidding, say, £1,000 and discover that nobody else bid more than £5. And you feel like a real idiot at that point. So it requires a lot of thinking about what the other people in the auction are likely to do. And the designer of the auction also needs to think about that. Also needs to think about, well, will people bid more or will they bid less if they see each other's bids? Because there are arguments both ways. So an auction, I think, is a great example of a game.
And it comes somewhat to your ability to estimate the other people's payoff values, basically.
Yes. So an interesting example, and the 3G license auctions, the mobile phone spectrum license auctions are an example of this, but maybe an even clearer example is, imagine you're a bunch of oil companies and you're bidding for the right to drill under Alaska. It's the kind of manly thing that oil companies used to do in the 1960s and 1970s. So how much are you willing to pay for the right to drill under Alaska? Well, there's two questions. One is how much oil is there, and the other is what will the price of oil be in future? And there's a famous early paper in auction, not even auction theory, famous early paper about auctions, published by 3 petroleum engineers in, I think, the Journal of Petroleum Engineering. They were called Capon, Clapp and Campbell, published in 1970. And what they found was that companies had systematically overbid by quite a lot. And you could see this because they weren't making a lot of money. And you could retroactively go, well, if we scaled up or down the bids of these companies, if you took any particular company and just said, hold every other bid constant, would this company have been better off if it had doubled all its bids or if it had halved all its bids? If you double all your bids, you win more. If you halve all your bids, you win less, but you pay less. And they found that the typical company would have done a lot better by scaling back their bids by maybe 2/3, even if no other company changed what they did. And they called this phenomenon the winner's curse. It's interesting because there's really no maths, no serious maths, and there's no game theory in this paper. It's just an empirical observation. But what's going on there is auctions systematically select for the most optimistic people. So if you've got all your geologists go around and they say, we don't think there's any oil there, well, you're not going to bid much in the auction. So some companies will have optimistic geologists and some companies will have pessimistic geologists. And you might say, well, on average, it'll all work out. But the auction does not select the average bidder. The auction selects the highest bidder. And even though there was a huge spike, famous spike in oil prices in the 1970s, a lot of these companies were still regretting not bidding less and, being willing to win less often, but also to pay less. And this became known as the winner's curse. If you play game theory perfectly, there's no winner's curse. Like if you properly figure out the information that everyone has and, work through the uncertainties and do all the maths, if you do all that, there's no winner's curse. But turns out it's quite hard and people didn't do it. There's also a huge incentive, by the way, as these companies, so your colleague at Vodafone presumably would hire a bunch of game theorists to run around talking about the winner's curse a lot. Because not only do you want to figure out the winner's curse, you want every other company in the auction to be worried about the winner's curse and to be pulling their bids back. So there's a lot going on. It's
interesting how it is still complicated, even though theoretically, if no one is prepared to pay more than would make the thing profitable for them, like if they say, this is the amount our company can afford to spend on this. But then, if the value of the thing isn't necessarily 100% known yet, and it might turn out later to be worth more, then this makes it more complicated. And then the fact that you've got competition kind of pushes you to bid more maybe than you can afford to.
Or the thing is that people often aren't people aren't necessarily excellent game theorists, excellent players of this game, right? It's like the thing where people bid on eBay auctions, and then they go and look at their bid is outbid, and they go and put in a new bid. Or a couple of minutes before, they're sort of saying, "Oh, if I get outbid, I'm going to increase my bid," or whatever. Well, they shouldn't. They should just put in the amount that they're willing to pay, and then either you get it for at most the amount that you're willing to pay, or you get outbid and somebody else has paid what you judge to be too much for this object, and you're happy either way. But people don't kind of behave like that.
So I'm wanting to be guided by you guys, but in the last few minutes, should we talk about the interesting, innovative and mathematically complex auctions that the Bank of England are now using in order to inject liquidity into the financial system? Or would you like me to discuss my research, which will teach you how to bid at Monopoly? I see Katie's caught on the horns of a dilemma.
I mean, yeah.
I can try and do both. So let me tell you briefly about the Bank of England stuff. This is also work by my old thesis supervisor, Paul Klemperer, and others. The way to think of this is, imagine you were going to bid in an auction for wine, and you like a particular kind of white wine from a certain region. You're really kind of fond of Meursault, and that's the wine you really want. But fundamentally, you're having a party, and if it's white wine and it's not Meursault, that's okay. If it's red wine or sparkling wine, that's okay. But you would rather have the Meursault. So we get back to the problem we had earlier of bidding on all of these different lots. How much are you willing to bid for, the first crate of wine that comes up, which happens to be, some Pinot Noir. And, if that was a really good deal, you'd happily buy the Pinot Noir, but you kind of want to wait for the Meursault and see how much the Meursault is selling for. And it turns out you can design a combinatorial auction where you basically type in, this is all facilitated by a computer, all the different kinds of combinations that you're willing to have. You basically say, look, I don't want to buy more than 144 bottles of wine. My preferred wine is Meursault. I'm willing to pay £5 a bottle more for Meursault than for any other kind of wine. But, if there's another wine that's on sale that's cheaper, then I'd like to buy that instead. Or maybe I end up with half Meursault and half this other kind of wine. Or maybe if there's a great deal, actually I'm willing to go to 200 bottles of wine, but it'd have to be a really good deal. And effectively using a computer interface, you can type in all of these possible combinations. Everyone else in the auction can type in the same kind of thing. You can just submit a single bid, you can draw a demand curve, the whole thing, and the computer just figures it all out and allocates everybody their wine. The analogy for the Bank of England is, it might be the Bank of England is willing to lend different banks money in the middle of a financial crisis in exchange for different assets that those banks have. This is the problem that the Bank of England was facing in 2007, 2008 in the financial crisis, needed to get cash onto the balance sheets of banks to prevent them collapsing, but the banks have got to give the Bank of England something in return. And how do you trade off a really good asset versus really, really dodgy subprime loans? And that could be the Meursault versus the Pinot Noir. So again, you can run an auction where you're trading off all of these different factors of quantity and quality simultaneously. And with a modern computer, it's absolutely no problem for everyone to submit their bids. The computer just clunks around for a second and then says, okay, here is the allocation from every single person of all of these different assets that are on offer. So that's where auction theory is going these days, much more complex than a simple, we've got one good and everyone's in a room and they just raise the price. Have we got time to talk about Monopoly?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
So I got interested in this. I did an internship once where there was an oil company wanting to buy petrol stations in Eastern Europe. All of the petrol stations in Eastern Europe basically being privatized. They used to be owned by the governments of these different Eastern European states, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, so on. And they're selling off their petrol stations. And I was talking to somebody at one of these oil companies who said, well, we're going to bid, I can't remember the details, but it was something along the lines of, we're going to bid in Hungary. We don't actually want to bid, we don't want to win in Hungary, but we really want to use up the budget of this other oil company so that when the Czechoslovakian government sell off their petrol stations, then we can get them for cheap. And that, I thought to myself, hang on a minute, that's interesting. And I've never seen that analysed in game theory, the idea that there are different auctions and you might bid in an auction explicitly to use up somebody else's cash. And it turns out that there is an everyday example of this that we all know, and that is Monopoly. If you play Monopoly, according to the classic rules of Monopoly, stuff is getting auctioned off all the time. And you might constantly be getting involved in auctions that you don't really want to win because you want to squeeze other people for cash. You want them to spend too much. So that is effectively what I wrote my master's thesis in economics about. It was the manipulation of this budget constraint that you knew your opponents were facing and how you might do that if you were playing the auction perfectly. And in a nutshell, the result that you get is that prices slowly fall over time. If you've got a series of auctions, they get cheaper and cheaper because what happens is you credibly threaten to win the final auction at a really high price. And you've got the biggest budget. So everyone else goes, okay, we're going to get nothing if it goes to the last auction. So what we want to do is we want to get something early on. So you drive the price up high, but not all the way to the maximum. People are happy to take, a 5% profit. They spend all their money and you gradually knock people out of the auction by making this credible threat, I will crush you at the end if you don't take a nice deal now. So all of your opponents basically slowly exit the auction and then right at the end, you buy the last few goods at a very, very low price. It turns out there's a puzzle in auction theory called the declining price effect. So if you've got several things up for sale again and again and again, like a crate of wine and then another crate of wine and then another crate of wine, they tend to decline in price. And there have been lots of different attempts to explain why this should be, because it's all the same stuff, so it should all be the same price. And so my monopoly auctions theory is one of many explanations as to why prices for identical goods might slowly decline in a series of auctions.
It's interesting because there is a lot of, it sounds obvious, but there is game theory in board games. And, there's a lot of these kinds of things. I remember once thinking about, there's like various different games where you have a certain amount of resources and you spend it in different parts of the board. And like you can get into these little mini battles where you sort of, the more you put in, like it's going to resolve as whoever's got the most in that area wins it at the end. And the more you put in and the more other people put in, you kind of feel, I've already kind of invested in that bit. Yeah. So I really need to keep putting more in. And you have to watch out for that kind of thing.
Stealing farms in Carcassonne comes to mind.
Yeah, that kind of thing, yeah. But then unlike in the auction situation, because in the auction situation, if you're the second highest bidder, you don't pay anything at all. Whereas in these games, you're investing those resources and it's like a sunk cost and you then have to then keep putting more in. Whereas in the auction situation, you can be a bit clever and use it as almost as a threat rather than an actual investment.
Oh, Katie, wait until I tell you about the all-pay auction. So
what?
There is a kind of auction. It's called an all-pay auction, basically. Or you can have like a first and second bidder pay or first, second, third bidder pay. But you can design an auction where you just go, everybody puts in some money and the auctioneer keeps all the money and whoever bid the most wins the auction. It's called an all-pay auction. And it's a slightly weird way to design an auction, but it's actually a very good way to use game theory to model what is often called a war of attrition. A war of attrition is basically everybody just pays until there's only one person standing, but everybody who's exerted this cost, they all have to pay. That's quite a good model of certain activities in an economy, and you can model it using auction theory. And the great thing is, in auction theory, there's a famous result called the revenue equivalence theorem, which basically says that given certain assumptions, all auctions are basically going to raise the same amount of revenue. So you could basically say, look, it turns out an all-pay auction raises the same total amount of revenue as a much more traditional, much more easy to analyse auction. It's going to raise the same amount of cash. Everyone will come in, they'll bid really low, but everyone has to pay what they bid. So in the end, the auctioneer takes the same total amount of revenue. So you can use this trick, mapping one auction, the all-pay auction, onto another auction in order to solve these problems.
Okay, so I guess many people probably already know the answer to this, Tim, but how can people hear more of you talking about mathematical things or otherwise access things you're doing?
Well, people may well know the BBC radio show More or Less. They can find that in all the usual pod places or on Radio 4. My website is timharford.com, and a couple of projects that people might be interested in. I have a podcast called Cautionary Tales, which is all about disasters and the nerdy explanations behind those disasters. And I have a book just out in paperback, called How to Make the World Add Up, which I thoroughly and in an unbiased way recommend to everybody. How to Make the World Add Up. Go grab a copy, grab 10 copies.
Thank you. Brilliant.
And you can find us on Twitter. I am at Stex.
I'm at Peter Rowlett. The podcast itself is at Maths Objects.
And both Peter and I blog at aperiodical.com, which is where you can find more episodes of the podcast. And if you want to get in touch with us, if you've got any thoughts or suggestions, or you would like to make a sealed bid in an auction, please send it through by email to objects@aperiodical.com.
The music is Funk Game Loop by Kevin MacLeod, licensed under Creative Commons.